The last resort. We were told never to summon it. The warning was etched in our histories, whispered by the few ancient survivors who remembered passed down like a curse. They said that once it crossed the threshold of the void again, there would be no undoing it, no way to close the gate we had dared to pry open. But warnings mean little to the desperate. The Varnex had shattered our final defenses. Cities crumbled under skies the color of rust and old blood. The last planetary shields flickered and died, leaving only open graves beneath a burning, indifferent sun. We were no longer fighting for victory. We were fighting for a few more hours to say goodbye. Inside a bunker buried under 100 meters of iron-hard stone, we gathered generals' leaders, scavengers of lost hopes. There was no more council, no more nation-states, only survivalists and cynics clinging to the ragged edges of a dying world. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't even a leader. I had been a scholar once, a name lost in the dust of forgotten archives. But war strips, titles from men and women alike, leaves only survivors. The room we stood in was ancient, older than any country, any government, perhaps even older than memory itself. The lights buzzed weakly, flickering like dying stars. And in the center of that forgotten place stood a console shaped like an altar, humming with a life that should not have been possible after so long. Maybe it had been waiting for us. Counselor Trell, her hands trembling, her face pale but resolute, stepped forward. From around her neck, she pulled a small crystal, dark as a black hole, and cut into a shape that hurt the eye to look at them. At the key, the last forbidden key. "This is madness," someone whispered behind me. Trell didn't answer. She slid the crystal into the altar's waiting socket. The response was immediate. A pulse of red light swept over the chamber. The glyphs carved into the floor, once thought to be merely decorative, ignited like veins of molten metal. The air grew thick, vibrating with a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. The walls themselves seemed to breathe. "You know what this means," Trell said, her voice soft but deadly sharp. "Once it comes, there will be no controlling it." Her words were a formality. We had already made our choice. I found my voice somehow activate the summoning, I said, and the room howled. It wasn't a sound any of us could have prepared for. It wasn't mechanical or natural. It was the sound of existence itself buckling under the weight of an ancient memory. Space twisted. Light fractured. For a moment I saw things that made my stomach rebel. Shadows moving against geometry that had no right to exist. Teeth sprouting from the walls, time folding like broken paper. And then something tore through the center of the room. The rupture was not violent. It was inevitable, like a prophecy made flesh. From the rift, a figure stepped forward. It looked human, but every fiber of my being screamed otherwise. The figure was tall, built like a soldier, naked, save for the intricate symbols carved across its skin. Symbols that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Its presence hit us like a tidal wave. The air grew dense. Metal supports groaned. Several of us dropped to our knees without conscious thought. This wasn't fear. It was recognition. Something ancient in our blood, acknowledging something far older and far greater than ourselves. It turned its head slowly, scanning the room with eyes that were not eyes. Twin voids, twin galaxies caught in endless collapse. Trell fell first, her hands pressed against the stone as if to anchor herself. "It worked," she gasped. "We summoned it." The figure tilted its head, regarding us like curious insects under a dying sun. Then it spoke, not aloud, but inside our skulls, a voice made of broken thunder and frozen oceans. "You have awakened the wrath your ancestors feared." It said. "We had no choice," Trell whispered. "The Varnex. They're ending us." The figure smiled, then a smile without warmth, without humanity. "You seek salvation," it said. "But I am no savior. I am the memory of your betrayal." The lights overhead shattered, plunging us into red-lit darkness. And in that moment, I understood. We had not summoned a hero. We had summoned a reckoning. Awakening the old blood. The chamber trembled around us, groaning under the impossible pressure, bleeding from the rift. Every breath tasted like iron. Every heartbeat felt stolen from a dying clock. The figure stood at the center of it all, a monument of ancient rage and silent judgment. It didn't move like a man. It moved like gravity wearing the shape of flesh. Each subtle shift of its body bent the air, warped the light as if reality itself struggled to accommodate its existence. The glyphs on the floor pulsed brighter, searing orange. Now each beat of their light, syncing with the slow, deliberate breathing of the being. Around us, walls cracked. Stone split. Consoles sparked and flickered, struggling against forces beyond comprehension. Counselor Trell rose shakily to her feet, Her face was pale, her eyes wide with awe and terror braided together. "We summoned the human," she whispered again as if trying to convince herself it was real. It regarded her not with hostility, but with something worse, disinterest. It stepped forward, once bare feet touching the molten glowing glyphs without harm. Each step sounded like a tolling bell, not loud but heavy, resonating in our bones. I could feel the ancient weight of it, of him pressing down on us. This was not a soldier, not a weapon. It was a memory of what we had been before fear taught us to forget. The human turned its gaze toward the heavens. Though stone and metal stood between it and the open sky, I knew it could see beyond them as if physical barriers meant nothing. Above, the Varnek's fleets moved like vultures over a dying feast. Dread ships, massive and cruel, darkened the atmosphere with their presence. They had come for our final breath. The humans smiled faintly, not with kindness nor cruelty, only inevitability. "They remember," it murmured into the marrow of our souls. "Even after all this time, they remember." The chamber darkened further. The consoles snapped off and the air thickened, viscous and heavy. Somewhere far away, alarms wailed a hollow mechanical mourning. The human raised a hand lazily toward the ceiling. Reality bent, not just the light or the air, but the very rules of existence twisted around its fingers. I watched, heart frozen in my chest, as space itself folded like origami, tearing itself apart in silence. Then the human vanished. No flash, no roar. Just absence, pure and sudden, like the universe forgetting something that had been there a moment before. The walls of the bunker trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. Cracks spiderwebbed through the reinforced stone. We staggered, clutching anything solid. The security monitors, somehow still alive, flickered erratically. And what we saw through them stole what little breath we had left. The Varnek's dreadships, the invincible giants that had choked our skies for years, began to shudder. One by one, there were no explosions, no missile strikes, no visible attacks. They simply unraveled. Great armored behemoths, proud terrors of the stars, twisted and cracked, as if the very fabric of their being refused to sustain itself any longer. Their hulls split along invisible seams. Their reactors collapsed inward without sound. It was not destruction, it was rejection. And through the chaos, through the howling static of 100 dying ships, one chilling transmission slipped through, raw and unfiltered. "It walks again," a Varnek's captain hissed. "The old blood walks the stars." Another voice, broken and panicked, crackled in reply. "The apex returns, the eater of empires. Run, run." Then silence. A silence deeper than any vacuum. Trell clutched her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. What is it doing to them?" she gasped. I forced my voice to work. "It's reminding them." I said, "It's making them remember." The bunker shuddered again. Lights flickered weakly, casting the ruined chamber in sickly hues. Then, without warning, the air grew dense once more. The human had returned, but it was changed now. Its skin pulsed like molten metal under translucent flesh. Its eyes, once obsidian voids, now churned with the slow collapse of dying galaxies. Around it swirled an unseen field dense enough that the very atoms of the air crackled and sang. It looked hungrier. "They ran," the human said, voice low and almost amused. Trell staggered forward. Her voice cracked. Then it worked. "They're afraid of you." The human turned those collapsing stars for eyes toward her. "They remember," it corrected coldly. And somehow in that moment, a darker realization took root in my gut. It wasn't done, not by a long shot. Judgment beyond war. The human stood before us like a monument carved from memory and rage. The shifting heat that pulsed from its skin distorted the air, making it hard to tell where reality ended and nightmare began. Trell's legs gave out again. She dropped to her knees, arms limp at her sides, staring up at the figure with wide, glassy eyes. I remained standing, though I don't remember how. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe some last scrap of pride, but my heart was screaming the truth. My mind refused to say aloud. We had not summoned a weapon to save us. We had summoned a verdict. Outside, the last of the Varnek's dreadships burned. Their remains fell like black rain across the dying landscapes of our world. And in the heart of our bunker, the human watched their fall, not with satisfaction, but with a strange, detached sadness. It turned to us slowly, as if finally deigning to acknowledge our existence again. "You summoned me," it said, voice deep and hollow, "to destroy your enemy." It stepped toward the center platform, bare feet leaving darkened, scorched prints on the stone floor. The lights flickered and shattered overhead, plunging the room into a throbbing red gloom. "But first," the human continued, "let me show you what you truly summoned." It raised a single hand, The world convulsed. The air turned thick and heavy, pressing down like an ocean atop our chests. Reality twisted. The walls of the bunker cracked further. The consoles sparked and died. Telemetry screens exploded in showers of glass and static. We fell to the ground, gasping like fish dragged from water. And then the human was gone. Gone again. But this time we could still feel its presence, as if the whole planet now carried its imprint. The monitors, those few still sputtering, began to broadcast chaos from above. Drone feeds flickered across broken screens, images of Varnex ships buckling, soldiers scattering communication arrays, reduced to molten slag. Yet it wasn't the Varnex we focused on. It was the way our own structures, the monuments of our survival, began to tremble. Not under attack, under judgment. I stumbled toward the console, one hand pressed against a cracked support pillar. Incoming telemetry painted a bleak picture. Cities stuttering power grids, failing defensive systems, going dark. Not because of enemy fire, but because they refused to stand any longer under the weight of their own lies. The human had touched something deeper than infrastructure. It had touched the soul of our civilization and found it wanting. Trell clutched at my sleeve, her fingers cold. "What's happening?" she gasped. I looked at her and saw reflected in her eyes what I had already begun to understand. The human wasn't just tearing down the Varnex. It was tearing down us. The bunker shook again, but this time there was no impact, no external force. It was as if the foundation of our world was crumbling from within. Then the human reappeared. It stepped back onto the central dais, but its presence had changed once more. The field around it throbbed with gravitational force, dragging dust, shattered stone, and even light itself inward toward it. Its skin shimmered, etched with constellations we did not recognize. Its eyes no longer resembled stars, they resembled singularities, patient and endless. Trell forced herself to her feet, voice shaking. "Will you destroy the rest of them?" she asked. The human's gaze turned to her slowly, deliberately. "Not yet," it said. "First I must finish what I started." My heart stuttered in my chest. What did you start?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. The human smiled, a slow, terrible smile. "Justice," it said. "And justice begins not with the enemy, but with the cowards who let them rise." The words hit like hammers to the spine. Trell's knees buckled again, but she caught herself, shaking her head in denial. "We didn't," she started. "You did," the human said coldly. "Maybe not you directly, but you are the heirs to the betrayal." The room grew colder. Frost began to form along the broken consoles, creeping up the stone pillars. Every screen glitched and blinked in spasms of light. The human began to pace the perimeter of the dais, each step deliberate, each word a sentence. "You sold colonies to buy peace. You bartered with invaders to preserve your own comforts. You watched others bleed while you calculated tolerable losses. And you buried the truth so deeply, you thought it would never claw its way back." Trell's face twisted in anguish. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "That wasn't us," she cried. "It was generations ago." The human paused and looked at her with something almost like pity. "And yet," it said softly, "you wear their sins like heirlooms." A massive tremor shook the bunker. Somewhere far above, we heard the distant groan of tectonic plates grinding against one another. The sky itself rebelling against the weight of history. On the main screen, before it shattered completely, we saw it. The Varnex flagship, the Wrathbringer, burning as it fell through the atmosphere, leaving a trail of red fire across the poisoned sky. No enemy fleet remained. No enemy army. Only us and the reckoning we had unleashed. The human faced us once more. "I was sealed away," it said. "Not because I was too weak, but because I was too strong." Humanity feared what it had created, so they locked me beyond time and memory. Its voice hardened into something ancient and terrible. "And now you have freed me." Trell collapsed to the ground, sobbing. "We didn't know," she whispered. "We didn't know what you really were." The human knelt beside her, the gravitational field warping the air into swirling patterns of invisible pressure. It leaned close, its voice a funeral bell inside our minds. "You had a choice," it whispered, "and you made it too late." It rose to its full, impossible height. Its gaze turned to me, heavy and knowing. "And you, scholar," it said, "do you still believe I came to save you?" I opened my mouth. No words came out. I remembered the forbidden whispers hidden in our deepest archives, the stories of the old blood, the erased histories of what humans had once been, before the galaxy feared us so much it tore out its own memories to forget. And I understood at last the terrible truth. The human hadn't come to save us. It had come to judge us. And judgment was already here. Fall of the Council. The alarms howled like wounded beasts. But we no longer paid them any mind. Our true predator stood within the bunker, cloaked in the memory of forgotten wars and ancient betrayals. Outside, the world burned and shuddered, but inside, the true reckoning had begun. Technicians scrambled at dead consoles, shouting fragmented reports, sector after sector falling dark, not from Varnek's assault, but from internal collapse. Infrastructure power grids, defense lines all crumbling, as if rejecting the very civilization that built them. Trell stumbled to the main terminal, her fingers shaking as she tried to stabilize the system. Static screamed from every communication line. "The Varneks have landed in Sector 9. A technician cried, his voice cracking. "We've lost contact with the Northern Defense Ring," another shouted. It didn't matter. It was already too late. The human moved among us, silent and inevitable. It didn't rush. It didn't threaten. It didn't need to. Reality itself bent to its presence. Every step it took left blackened, scorched imprints on the ground. Every breath it drew made the air denser, heavier, harder to survive. It walked toward the central platform again. With a simple motion, raising both hands, it summoned a hum, so deep, so vast, it made our teeth ache. Reality shimmered. The platform's stones cracked apart like dry riverbeds, revealing a pool of shimmering silver light. Underneath, a hidden layer a buried truth. Through the ruptures in the walls, we could glimpse the surface, and what we saw made my blood freeze. The skies over the capital city, the so-called cradle of the unified council, were fractured. Literally, cracks spread across the atmosphere like spiderwebs glowing with eerie silver blue light. Time itself seemed to stutter around them, slowing in some places, racing in others. Crowds of survivors had gathered in the streets, staring upward in paralyzed awe and terror. They didn't know if they were witnessing salvation or annihilation. Neither did we. Trell grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the emergency transport lifts. "We have to get to the council," she said, voice taut with urgency. "We have to warn them." Warn them of what? That the past they buried was waking up. That the sins they had built their empire upon were clawing back into the light. Still, I nodded. There was nothing else to do. If there was any hope of survival, it lay there in confronting the architects of this broken world. The journey should have taken 3 hours. It took 6. The transport faltered again and again. Buffeted by unseen forces, gravity currents rippled unnaturally across the landscape. Whole regions flickered in and out of phase as if the planet itself were struggling to stay stitched together. By the time we reached the capital, it was already too late. Smoke coiled into this broken sky. Government towers flickered like dying candles. The old banners of the Unified Council lay torn across shattered streets. The Council Tower, the supposed heart of civilization, stood surrounded by armed forces. Desperate and panicked, soldiers barked incoherent orders. Drones buzzed erratically, their systems malfunctioning. We pushed through this chaos, flashing what little authority we had left. No one tried to stop us. No one cared anymore. Fear had hollowed them out. Inside the council chambers, the high lords and ministers huddled around flickering displays, faces ghostly under the failing lights. Panic hung in the air, thick and choking. Councillor Wren spotted us and stormed forward. His face was red veins standing out along his neck. "What did you unleash?" he bellowed, voice cracking with rage and terror. "You bypassed every protocol. You dove into forbidden archives." Trell stood firm, though her hands trembled. "We had no choice," she said. "You sat here and watched us die. You waited for the Varneks to tire of the slaughter. You bargained with our lives," we acted. "You summoned a monster," another counselor shouted. "You doomed us all." Before more accusations could fly, the chamber trembled, dust rained from the ceiling. Consoles blinked and died. A pale aide stumbled into the room, his uniform stained with blood and ash. His voice was a broken whisper. "It's here." Silence fell like a blade. Every screen in the chamber flickered to life. One by one, they showed the same image, a single figure walking alone through the fractured streets approaching the tower. No army, no fleet, just the human. And everything around it was dying in silence. Silence. Defense grids collapsed. Automated turrets melted. The very systems meant to protect the council shut themselves down, as if the world itself no longer recognized their authority. Councillor Wren staggered back. "Call the off-world reinforcements now, use everything," he screamed. But it was too late. The human entered the base of the tower. Without fanfare, without resistance. One moment it wasn't there. The next it stood behind Wren, silent and inevitable. "You had everything," the human said, "and you built monuments to yourselves while your people died in the dirt." Wren spun to flee, He didn't make it 2 steps. With a movement so casual it was almost gentle, the human reached out and Ren vanished. Not killed, not torn apart. Erased as if he had never existed. The chamber erupted into screams. Ministers scrambled over each other, some dropped to the ground, babbling apologies. Others tried to run, only to collapse in blind terror. But the human wasn't looking at them anymore. It stood before the panoramic windows, gazing out over the burning city, the fractured sky, the rising crowds. Trell whispered beside me, her voice breaking, "It's not here to kill us." I understood then the human wasn't bringing death. It was bringing an end, the end of their reign, the end of their lives, the end of the world they had built atop the broken bones of forgotten promises. And there was nothing left to stop it. Whisper of the future. The human turned away from the window, its silhouette bathed in the fractured light of the broken sky. It regarded the collapsing council chamber with a gaze that was not cruel nor kind, merely inevitable. "You built your thrones atop graves," it said, its voice a soft rumble through the stone and steel. "And now the dead come to reclaim the foundation." No one answered, no one could. The few remaining ministers clung to each other like shipwrecked sailors on a sinking island, their robes stained with fear and the last tatters of authority. But the human paid them no further mind. It turned instead to the city beyond. The masses had begun to stir, not with weapons, not with violence, but with presence. Thousands moved as one, filling the broken plazas, the cracked streets, the hollow monuments. The forgotten were rising, not with rage, but with memory. Trell stood frozen at my side, hands clenched at her sides. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "It's not just tearing down," she whispered. "It's giving something back." And she was right. The human raised one hand, palm outward toward the gathering crowds. From every shattered screen, every cracked speaker system, its voice rippled outward, soft, relentless, undeniable. "You were abandoned," it said. "You endured." "You were silenced," it said. "You remember." "You are not the forgotten," it said. "You are the core." The words struck like lightning in dry fields. Across the city, people straightened, stared upward, and for the first time in a generation, they moved not from fear, but from hope. They didn't march in anger. They didn't storm the tower. They came to reclaim what had always been theirs. The human stepped forward to the edge of the chamber. It did not raise weapons, did not call for blood. It simply stood there, arms open, a living beacon. One of the counselors, a younger man desperate, clinging to the old ways, drew a hidden plasma pistol from within his robes. His hands shook as he leveled it at the human's back. "This is madness," he hissed under his breath. "We can't let it take everything." He fired. The shot never reached. Mid-air, the plasma bolt froze, a suspended shard of light trembling against the immutable will of the human. Without turning, the human flicked a single finger. The energy dispersed into harmless motes. "You still think this is about control," it said, voice filled with something almost like sadness. "But I was never here to rule." It turned then, facing the would-be assassin. "You chose fear," it said, "and fear always destroys itself." The young counselor didn't scream. He simply vanished, erased not with violence, but with absolute, irrevocable certainty. The chamber fell silent again, save for the distant rumble of the city awakening. Trell collapsed into one of the abandoned chairs, bearing her face in her hands. I stood beside her, my heart hammering, a funeral drum against my ribs. Outside, the crowd had reached the base of the tower. They did not chant, they did not rage, they simply waited. The human stepped forward, standing tall above them, its voice filling the broken world one last time. "These are your new architects," it said. "The ones who know the ones who will rebuild not from conquest, but from endurance." The counselors gasped in realization. The old bloodlines were finished, not by fire, not by swords, but by silence, by irrelevance. The human turned back to us one final time. Its gaze swept over the chamber, over the ruins of the world that had been. "To build again," it said, "you must first let the lie die." And then without ceremony, it stepped off the edge, not falling, descending, as if the air itself carried it gently downward into the waiting arms of the people. The crowd parted to receive it. No violence, no cheers, only beginning. The human disappeared into the sea of faces, and the silence it left behind was more powerful than any declaration of victory. No parades followed, no grand proclamations, only the long, aching breath of a world realizing it had survived but had no idea what to do next. In the days that followed, the council never reconvened. The surviving ministers scattered like ashes in a storm. Some fled to off-world sanctuaries. Others simply faded into obscurity, their names forgotten even before they left. No one came looking for them. No one asked for their guidance. The world had moved on without them. In the streets and plazas of the capital, Something new began to take root. Not a new empire, not a new regime, something simpler, something raw. People gathering, talking, building. No thrones, no banners. Only memory and the fragile, stubborn seed of a different future. And yet no one celebrated, because we all knew something vast and ancient still loomed over us. Something we did not understand. Something human. Threats in the void. The silence that followed was not peace, it was the breath before a new storm. For months after the humans' disappearance into the rising crowds, the galaxy held its breath. Worlds long oppressed began to stir. Colonies built from the ruins of the Varnex's shadow began to rebuild, not under the banners of fallen empires, but with bare hands, battered tools, and stubborn dreams. The cities that once stood atop the broken spines of the forgotten grew wild and strange alive, with ideas that had been silenced for generations. There were no rulers now, only those willing to listen. Trell and I remained in the capital and watching the fragile rebirth with wary hope. She had changed quieter now, as if carrying the weight of everything we had witnessed inside her bones. We often sat atop the ruins of the old council tower, speaking little, watching much. But change, however raw and pure, is never left alone. Not in a galaxy built on fear. Rumors began to drift through the void. Old warlords displaced, noble families, forgotten powers. They whispered of the human. They spoke its name not as a curse nor a savior, but as an opportunity. In the lawless edges of the outer reach, deep beyond, where even the Varnex once feared to tread a new syndicate, was rising the Crimson Rung. Born from broken warlords and exiled scientists, the Crimson Rung saw in the human not a lesson but a weapon. If it can be summoned once, their leader declared, it can be bound, it can be replicated. His name was Rival, a former exoscientist turned technoist, brilliant and ruthless. Where others saw terror in the human's wake, Rival saw only leverage. He gathered remnants of shattered fleets, rogue AIs, scavengers of forbidden lore, and together they began building something monstrous. We learned of it through whispers, fragmented reports from resistance cells, half-burned messages passed in secret across the collapsing relay networks. They're building a gate, one scout told us, her voice shaking. Not a summoning like you did. A trap, a prism chamber designed to contain it. Trell turned away when she heard, "Idiots," she whispered. "They don't understand what they're trying to cage." Neither did we, not fully, but we understood enough to know this. You do not chain a force that exists to remind you of freedom. The Crimson Rung didn't care. They weren't scholars. They were desperate men, chasing a myth they thought they could master. They scavenged pieces of broken Varnex dread ships, spliced it with old human mythos, corrupted echo scripts from the first summoning. A Frankenstein ritual built not from reverence but greed. And when they finished, they sent out their signal, loud and defiant, across pirate frequencies, across abandoned relays, a flare into the black daring the human to come. It answered, but not as they expected, not as a man, not even as a figure. It came as a wave. Reality buckled across Sector Black 9. Half the Crimson Rung's fleet vanished instantly, erased as if history itself refused to acknowledge them. The rest turned on themselves. Ships folding inward, crews tearing apart at the seams of their own minds. Rival tried to flee. He didn't make it. When recovery teams later searched the debris field, they found no bodies. No wreckage. Only a hollow prism chamber, still humming faintly with stolen echoes. Etched inside its inner walls in language both ancient and terrifyingly new, was a single message. You cannot bind what remembers its freedom. Trell and I read the report in silence, the glow of the screens casting long shadows across the ruined command hall. She leaned back, her face hollow with exhaustion. "They keep thinking it's a thing," she murmured, "something they can use a control break." I said nothing, because she was right. The human was never a thing. It was a mirror, a lesson, a scar. We had tried to forget now, walking the stars, burning away every lie it touched. And some of us still hadn't learned. Across the edges of the fractured galaxy, new factions began to rise, each with their own twisted memory of what the human had done. Some worshipped it, building crude temples from the bones of abandoned cities. Others feared it, painting its symbol on banners of defiance, hoping fear would protect them from its gaze. Warlords rose again in the deep void draped in stolen myths. Rogue empires whispered promises of a return to order, a familiar, rotting kind of order. And through it all, the human remained silent, unseen, waiting, until it wasn't. Echoes of defiance. The human returned not in fire, not in fury, but in reflection. It stepped out of a mirror in the sky above the city of Varth, the capital of the fractured rim worlds. The mirror didn't shatter. It bent warping the skyline like heat above desert sands. One moment the plaza was filled with anxious crowds and soldiers in gray armor. The next silence fell like a physical force as the human walked among them, barefoot, calm, and terribly present. The city of Varth had already fallen into the grip of a new power. They called themselves the Steel Path. Not an empire, they said, not a dominion, a return to order. But their banners were the same, their fleets were the same, their promises were the same, hollow lies repainted in sterile steel. The human walked slowly toward the heart of the plaza, the crowds parting before it like tides fleeing an unseen moon. Soldiers snapped rifles into firing position. Drones spun up their plasma cannons. Commanders barked orders into comms fraying with static. The human didn't slow. A commander clad in polished gray stepped forward, flanked by armored elites. His voice, amplified by comms, echoed across the plaza. "You are unregistered," he declared. "Identify yourself." The human smiled faintly. Not warm, not mocking, just knowing. "I have no name," it said, "only memory." The commander stiffened. "Then you are a threat to order." The human's gaze seemed to stretch beyond him, beyond the plaza, beyond even the stars. "No," it said quietly. "I am proof your order was never real." The commander didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon. The line of soldiers fired as one. Dozens of high-velocity rounds and plasma bursts ripped through the air and dissolved into harmless petals before touching the human skin. The plaza gasped. The soldiers faltered. Some dropped their weapons without even realizing it. Faces slack with awe and dread. The commander gritted his teeth, drew a polished vibroblade, and charged one last act of blind, desperate arrogance. The human didn't move. It merely glanced at the blade and the weapon unraveled. Not broken, not melted, simply undone. The atoms that made it a blade remembered being part of a mountain, and the mountain never wanted to kill. The commander stumbled and fell to his knees, staring at his empty hands. The human knelt before him, pressing two fingers lightly to his forehead. "You are not my enemy," it said. "You are my echo, and echoes fade." Across the sky, the Steel Path fleet deactivated. No explosions, no fire, just a silent collapse of power. Ships drifted, dead in orbit. Battleships powered down like toys dropped by a distracted child. Satellites winked out one by one. In the plaza, the soldiers broke ranks and fled, or simply stood dazed and blinking as if waking from a long nightmare. The people of Varth surged forward, not in riot, not in rage, but in a great exhale of hope. The human turned to face them, arms open, not commanding but witnessing. Trell found me in the crowd, breathless, her face pale and shining with something like wonder. "It didn't fight them," she said. "It didn't need to," I replied. "It just reminded them they never mattered." The human looked up once more at the broken sky and then vanished as simply and silently as it had come. No roar, no storm. Only the weight of choices returned to our own hands. That was the last time anyone saw it in Varth. But its absence was louder than any battle cry. Across the fractured colonies, news spread like wildfire. The human had broken another empire without lifting a weapon, without bloodshed, only memory. And not everyone celebrated. For every colony that rose from the ashes, for every council rebuilt, without crowns or chains, there were others who watched from the shadows, those who saw not liberation, but a threat to their own ambitions. In the dying remnants of the Outer Reach coalition, far beyond dead sectors, abandoned by the old empires, whispers grew louder. The Crimson Rung was not dead. Others like them, warlords, syndicates, false prophets, began gathering again. But this time they no longer sought to capture the human. They sought to surpass it. If it can tear down, they said, then so can we. They misunderstood everything again. They didn't see that the human wasn't an engine of destruction. It was a mirror, a reminder, a reckoning. It tore down what deserved to fall and offered no replacement but the choices of those left standing. Some would rise, some would fall, but the human would not decide we would. And that terrified them more than any army ever could. Trell and I stood atop the crumbling remains of Varth's council hall, days after the human's departure, watching the crowds below build new structures from the bones of the old. "They're afraid," she said quietly, "not of dying, not of losing. They're afraid of being forgotten." I nodded slowly, because forgetting was the true death. The human had not come to save us from our enemies. It had come to save us from ourselves, or at least to give us the chance to try. Whether we deserved that chance was still a question left unanswered. The echo of its presence lingered long after the last petal of fire fell from the sky, and somewhere beyond stars, still scarred from wars too old to name, I knew it was still watching, not judging, not ruling. Waiting to see if we could finally remember what we had once been and what we still might become. The mirror remains. The human did not return again. Not to Varth, not to the Rim colonies, not to the silent cities built atop the bones of the old world. It had never intended to stay. It had never intended to rule. It had shown us a mirror and left us to decide what to do with the reflection. For a time, the galaxy trembled on the edge of something new. In the ruins of old capitals and shattered fleets, communities began to rise without kings or conquerors. The silence spoke again. The forgotten remembered. It was not perfect, it was not easy, but it was real. Trell and I remained at the heart of the capital, living in the shadow of the tower the human had emptied. The council chambers, once a sanctum of lies and whispered betrayals, now stood open to the sky. No guards, no rulers, only people. They came in small groups, at first not to seize power but to talk about survival, about rebuilding a beat arm, about remembering. No decrees, no thrones. Just the slow, painful work of becoming something better. Some nights, Trell and I would sit on the cracked steps of the old tower, watching children chase each other through the abandoned plazas, their laughter echoing against broken walls. We wanted a weapon, Trell said one evening, her voice distant, but it gave us a mirror. I nodded slowly, unable to deny it. We had summoned something ancient, something terrible, and it had answered with truth. Not conquest, but peace, even fragile peace, does not last in galaxies built on bones. It wasn't long before the next storm gathered at the edges of the stars. From the far fringe worlds untouched by the humans passing, a new power rose. The Steel Path. Reborn. Not an empire of dread ships or tyrants, but something colder, sharper. A doctrine of order over freedom, efficiency over memory. They called the human a myth, a fabrication meant to dismantle the natural order, a weakness that had to be purged. They came not with screaming fleets, but with diplomats bearing contracts, with soldiers bearing clean clinical precision, offering unity in exchange for security, order in exchange for obedience. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. Some worlds, exhausted by chaos, accepted their terms. Others resisted, fractured, desperate, and everywhere a single question whispered like smoke. Would the human return? I did not know. None of us did, until the sky cracked again. It happened in Varth as the Steel Path's legions marched into the outer sectors. Their ships orbited above sleek and soulless. Their soldiers filled the plaza's faces hidden behind mirrored helmets. The people stood silent, refusing to kneel. Not with weapons, not with rage, with presence, with memory. And then the air bent, not with noise, not with light, with reflection. A mirror opened above the skyline, and through it stepped the human. Not blazing, not roaring, calm, silent. Barefoot, unarmed, unyielding. The Steel Path's commanders reacted instantly, shouting orders, raising weapons. Energy cannons fired, but the rounds dissolved into mist before touching its skin. Steel became pollen, fire became song. The human walked through them without flinching, each step unraveling the illusion of power they had built. The lead commander, armored in perfect steel gray, stepped forward, voice amplified by command comms. "You are a threat to order," he declared. The human smiled softly, almost sadly. "I am proof," it said, "that your order was never real." The commander, furious, drew a blade of quantum-forged steel. He lunged, but the blade unraveled in his hands, the atoms forgetting their purpose. He fell to his knees, defeated not by violence, but by memory. The human touched his forehead gently. "You are not my enemy," it whispered. "You are my echo." And echoes fade. Above us in orbit, the Steel Path's fleets went dark. One by one, their engines died, their weapon systems powered down, not by sabotage, not by battle, by refusal. As if the ships themselves remembered what they had once been and chose silence instead of tyranny. The people of Varth filled the plaza once again, standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes lifted toward the figure that had become more myth than man. Trell found me among them, breathless. "It didn't fight them," she said again, wonder filling her voice. "It reminded them they never mattered." I could only nod, because it was true. The human looked up at us one last time, as if asking, "Do you remember now?" And then it vanished. No roar, no flash, just silence. A silence heavy with possibility and with responsibility. That was the last time anyone ever saw it. But sometimes when the nights grew too still and the stars above flickered like half-remembered dreams, I could feel it. Not watching, not judging, waiting for the day we would no longer need it. Because the human had never been our savior. It had never been our destroyer. It had been our memory, our mirror. And someday, if we were brave enough, if we were honest enough, if we remembered well enough, we would not need it to come again. Because we would already be what we had once been meant to become. Whole, enduring, free. Human,